Hi, everyone. Welcome back for another episode of Auto Heterophiles. Today, I'm joined by Taftaj, who is one of the more interesting trans women I've seen online. She has a lot of really interesting thoughts, and I'm glad to have her here today. So, thank you for taking the time, Taftaj.
Of course. Happy to be here.
I guess a good place to start is chronologically, and I'm just curious. When you look back on your life, like what are some of the earliest signs of behavior or thinking that you can, in retrospect, attribute to autogynephilia? Whether it's like yearning or eroticism or whatever it is that showed up.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think because there's sort of two pieces here. One is early life gender nonconformity. So I was pretty gender nonconforming from a very early age. My mother recounts dropping me off at kindergarten, and every time she would come to pick me up, I'd be like wearing a dress. I would just apparently every day I would just go straight to the costume section as soon as I was dropped off, change clothes, and then wear a dress for like the whole day. So there's that. And then I like begged my parents to buy me a little like white dress when I was a little bit older, around like 6 or so. And so I have a pretty long history of being gender nonconforming. And even from a very early age, people in my family, like my aunt, she's gay. And she was like, oh, this Taft kid, she's going to be special. She's going to grow up and, I think she was thinking I'd be gay or trans or something. And so it was pretty clear to people around me there was like something up about me. But I don't think I didn't contextualize it as anything sexual until I was older, like going through puberty around, 13 or 14. I was like a little bit of a late bloomer, but I pretty quickly found that when I imagined sexual fantasies in my head, I was like very focused on the women's role. And increasingly I found that like the degree to which I self-inserted as the girl in my fantasy, the more I found it to be arousing or interesting. And so I think the other piece of this, which is just like distinctly AGP, is just like, I think I found that the idea of being a woman at all, or being like a certain type of woman, like being the type of woman that I would feel attractive or beautiful or sexy as, that was like a big part of the sexual fantasy. So it wasn't enough to maybe just imagine myself as a sort of crudely gender swapped version of myself, or maybe just like as a like unpassing trans version of myself. That didn't really like feel interesting to me. It was specifically imagining myself as like a sort of idealized feminine version that was a key to a lot of my early sexual interests. And so I didn't have like a word for that. Like, so I didn't know that was like called AGP, and that would take like quite a few more years before I actually was able to like stick a label on that in specific, even years after I had even known about AGP or decided that I was trans. It took a while before I was able to be like, okay, this is AGP, what I'm feeling.
How did you learn about AGP? And when you did, how did you react to that knowledge?
Yeah, I learned about it pretty early on in transition because I was like so involved in like online internet communities, and I was involved in like 4chan and stuff at an early age, right when I was like 14. And so I was on like the LGBT board, and I was seeing people discuss HSTS and AGP and whatnot, and it's just not. It didn't fit my self-conceptualization, and part of that is just that it's very unflattering conception, especially if you don't know that much about AGP. The way that it's presented is kind of like this scary Buffalo Bill thing, and so you don't want to be like, that just doesn't. It doesn't feel like you, right?
It doesn't feel good too.
Yeah, doesn't feel right. And the other part of that was that I was and still am, from my perspective, I'm attracted to men, and that attraction feels very like genuine or direct to me. So that piece of my sexuality, my attraction to men, has always been like hard for me to square with AGP. And so the fact that I sort of transitioned young and didn't fit some of the stereotypes about trans people or about autogynephiles, and the fact that I was attracted to men, when I like found out about the typology, I didn't really feel like either category like described me. So I was just like, oh, whatever. And it wasn't until much later until actually, I saw you in some podcasts and you were describing AGP as a much more expansive thing than I had maybe heard about before. So like you were describing autosexuality and you were describing these elements that really seemed to describe my experience more deeply, that I sort of revisited the idea and eventually decided that, attraction to men sort of aside, there is a part of my sexuality which is, clearly, and I'd say like distinctly autogynephilic or autosexual. And yeah, that was a lot easier to come to terms with when I had heard the idea articulated in a maybe more full or less stigmatized way.
But yeah, that's cool that I had no idea that you seeing me on Probably Boyce's podcast helped you revisit it.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, because like I heard you on his podcast, and I remember thinking like, wow, she's smart and pretty self-aware, like with respect to just the way you talked about yourself, and also the political ideas you were discussing were interesting.
I
Because I was
appreciate
newer to
that.
right-wing
Yeah.
ideas at that time, and so it was interesting to hear other perspectives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole
Um,
wacky, wild world out there of political ideas.
yeah, but when during puberty, or not puberty, but I think you transitioned in your teen years, right? So like I'm curious
Mm-hmm.
how you went about doing that, because I know it's a lot of times when kids tell their parents that I might be trans, it doesn't necessarily go easily. So like how did that go?
Yeah, so I decided I was trans when I was 14 years old. And I pretty much immediately, like within a month, told my mother how I was feeling. And she didn't know like what I was talking about when I first mentioned it. So maybe that's like one aspect of this, is that when I transitioned, when I came to terms with my gender dysphoria and started bringing it up to my parents, it was before like Caitlyn Jenner had come out. And there just wasn't a lot of discourse publicly about what trans people were or what that entailed. And so I sort of had the freedom to work with them to discuss my gender identity without having to overcome any like initial bias in terms of them like knowing about this and having preconceptions about what is and isn't appropriate like medical intervention. So I think that helped. The other thing is, my mom was totally against me transitioning when I first came out to her. And it took like months of discussing with her, but also she ended up befriending a trans guy who was like an older guy, maybe in his like 50s, and he was a doctor and someone that she liked, and he talked to her about it and was able to like explain a lot of his perspective, and also just give her the peace of mind to know that like, for a lot of people this is a lifelong thing, and it's something that you can do successfully. You can transition, you can live a normal life if you do so. I think that really helped her. And then also, I've always been such an analytical person. In trying to convince her, I spent months and months talking to her about like data and stats and statistics and giving her all of these sort of rational arguments. And none of it worked. But it was when I was at the very end of, my rope, and I was a little desperate, I broke down in front of her and I cried about it. And I think she could see just how deeply I cared about this. And it was that moment that she decided to, at the very least, give it a shot. She would talk to a specialist about it. So we drove 6 hours to the nearest endocrinologist who did like youth transition, because I lived in, Colorado and like in, winding mountain passes, super far from Denver. And so it took a while to get there, but we did like a road trip, and she brought me in, and the specialist recommended Lupron and a tiny dose of estrogen, and 10 years later, and now I'm talking about AGP on internet podcasts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm glad you are talking about it, particularly because I feel like when a lot of trans women discuss youth medical transition, they're kind of uncritically in favor of it, particularly the later transitioners who sort of have sort of a like what if fantasy about if their life had gone different. Whereas when I've heard you talk about transition, you're much more ambivalent and even-handed about it.
Yeah, I'd like to think I am, for sure.
And are you still like, do you think you made the right decision to transition? Like, are you glad you went down the transsexual lifestyle pathway?
It's always hard. I think yes. I've gone back and forth on this exact question before, and I think at times in my life when I was feeling like maximally bad, when I was in like really rough places, I've had the feeling like, oh, it's none of it was worth it. And I think the thing is, I am glad, but I also think that a lot of the improvements in my life in mental health, they only started when I accepted that like transition alone and just trying to pursue a certain ideal of femininity could not actually make me feel good about life. And so I feel the most comfortable maybe now in my transition than I ever have. And part of that is that I have gotten way more comfortable with like the masculine elements of myself. And in learning to accept the things that I can't change about myself, and even kind of reconcile the idea that I might, there might be no coherent definition of woman that, includes me that I'd agree with, or maybe like at the very least, really reconciling my maleness in my mind. It's all those things that have put me on the path to actually get the most out of transition. So I guess the answer is yes, I am happy that I transitioned, but also I think that the way I was transitioning for a long time was not good, and not beneficial to my health. And I sort of wish that the way we talk about transition could be a little bit more realistic in terms of, the downsides or exactly what it can give for you. I think that once we start talking about those things, I was able to appreciate like, okay, I like wearing makeup. I like presenting female. I like, soft skin as a result of estrogen. And if that's what I get out of transition, like I'm okay with that. And that's good. And that's enough for me. And yeah, I'm happy with all of those things. And so even if I'm not like the perfect version of a woman in my head, I'm okay. So, yeah.
How did you said that before you became comfortable with the aspects of your maleness, that you were not doing transition right. Like, how were
Mhm.
you doing it before that wasn't as beneficial?
Yeah. I think there's an element of maybe LARPing in this that isn't beneficial. So I've always been very involved on the internet. I've always been very public, even since I was like quite young, like 15 or so. I was posting selfies on Reddit and they were getting lots of attention. And I would get like messages from people like, you know, telling me that I was jailbait or whatever, and that I had like dick sucking lips and all of these things. And
That's
yeah,
probably pretty intense.
crazy stuff. But I've always been very online, and I've always presented a version of myself, which is sort of only ever in like the best angles, right? And that even extended into like the AGP realm, right? So like knowing what AGP is and knowing what HSTS is, I was able to, as a teenager, craft an identity for myself within the trans circles that I was in that was kind of modeled off of what I thought an HSTS person was. And so I was able to like lean into a certain perception that maybe people had of me as a young transitioner and post like very flattering selfies. And, you know, people had an idea of me, which is this person who transitioned very young and whose life is kind of ideal, who passes really well, and et cetera, and et cetera. That continued into posting, you know, sexy photos online, getting lots of money for that on OnlyFans. And the result of all of this was just like layers and layers of constructed identity that were false. And all of these layers of identity were things that I drew value and meaning from. Like, I have value as a person because I fit into these categories in people's minds, or because people view me a certain way. And in person, that manifested as I have value because I can like pass sufficiently, or because I'm a woman, etc. And so I think that the problem with all of that was that I was placing tons of value in what other people thought of me. And what other people thought of me was not even necessarily true to what I thought of myself. So I think that for me, that approach to transition, which is constructing this sort of artificial identity, trying really hard to present myself a certain way, it led to a lot of pain. And I think that moving to a version of transition which focuses on the things that I actually like, right? I actually like wearing dresses and makeup and stuff. That's made me a lot more appreciative for the things that are in my power. It's made me a lot more connected to my own values. And it's made me a lot less concerned about what other people think. And so that shift in mindset has been really valuable for me.
Yeah. The shift towards the internal locus of control, basically.
Totally.
Yeah. No, I agree that that's good for AGPs in general, because
Mhm.
there's only so much, like, you can't control how other people see you.
Yeah.
You can choose, how to dress yourself, and you choose to some extent how you see yourself. And so there's just much more potential with the stuff you have control over, rather than getting mad about the things you don't have control over.
Totally. And the piece on that too is that, like, even if you do meet certain expectations that people have of you, those aren't always the values and expectations that might satisfy you. And so, like, what's really important is just that, like, you're living up to your own values more so than anything else. So shifting and reframing to that, focusing on what you really want, I think is really valuable.
Yeah, I agree fully with what you said. I'm so glad to have you here.
Amazing.
I'm curious with I know you. I think you either have an OnlyFans now or you did in the past. Like, how did that influence sort of how you dealt with your gender feelings and self-image? Because like I think a lot of AGPs might think that like to have a lot of subscribers on there would be like the most validating best thing ever, but I suspect there's a lot of like trade-offs and negative sides. So I'm curious like about your experience with that.
Yeah. I mean, again, I can only speak to my experience. So things probably different for different people. But going back to that, like, sort of LARPing thing that I was discussing earlier, I think I was presenting myself on there very inauthentically. And it caused a lot of distress to try to every week live up to a certain like false expectation or impossible standard. And the reality of doing OnlyFans is that you're constantly trying to raise that standard for yourself, right? You're trying to push the envelope always to, generate a little bit more money, or, get the next, set of 100 subscribers or whatever. And the result is that you're constantly in this arms race against yourself to present yourself in a way that is like maximally impossible and unreal. And so I think that it was frustrating when I would like take photos of myself and I wouldn't live up to what I knew I needed to live up to. So like if I took a photo of myself and like skin was not as pretty as it could be, or the shape of my body wasn't serving, it wasn't fish or whatever, I would just know that like, okay, well, that's going to impact me monetarily. And if I post photos like this online, they're not going to get a ton of likes. And so having that, instant feedback of like, oh, I'm not doing good enough was really hard. And then when I did do good, it wasn't like me, right? Because I wasn't just, they weren't just like, casual photos that I took of myself like randomly. They're like meticulously posed and angled and everything. I would like narrow my waist with editing and everything as well. So all of these things combined, you can't really take pride in the photos or getting the subscribers, but you can really feel bad when they like go down, or when you see a photo of yourself that isn't meeting your own standards. So it's really hard. I think that maybe if you're like an EGP and you like, you just like, you totally love how you look as you look, and you're just posting photos, purely for whatever your own enjoyment, and you don't really care about the numbers and etc. I think maybe like that's probably not going to be psychologically damaging in the way that OnlyFans was for me. But I feel so much better having moved away from that. I feel so much more comfortable with my appearance when I don't depend on it for an income. So
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because the hard thing I think about that too is that men are attracted to youth and time only goes in one direction. So like if you're constantly trying to one up yourself while nature is working against you, it seems particularly difficult.
Yeah, totally. It's brutal.
But do you think there's value in understanding AGP for like either the trans women who fit into the category or people or the AGPs who don't even transition? Like, Do you think it's helpful to know about it?
Yeah, I do. I think it's helpful even in like a much broader sense. So like I think AGP has kind of been used as a bludgeon against trans women. And I think there's a lot of hesitancy to embrace the label or to talk about it publicly because it's been used in this way. But I also think that, you know, I think if we talk about AGP publicly, there's sort of one of two results that can happen. Either we talk about AGP and AGP really is as bad and scary and as worthy of being used as a bludgeon against trans people as maybe some people fear. In which case, it's probably good for cisgender people to like know what AGP is, and it's probably good if something like that is brought out in the open, because people should not be relying on deception about their sexuality in order to, negotiate, societal standards for themselves. So that's one scenario. Scenario two, which I think is much more likely, is we talk about HB publicly, we bring it out into the light, and it turns out that it's actually not as scary as people think it is. And all sexuality can be kind of scary and weird and awkward, but we find out that AGP is not actually like that distinct from other sexualities, and like people can engage with it in a way that is maybe predatory or makes other people uncomfortable, but they can also engage with it in a way that is doesn't have those pernicious effects. And so I think that in that scenario, suddenly AGP can no longer be used as a bludgeon because it's been destigmatized, understood, it's been sanitized by the light. And so in either of those scenarios, either AGP is really, really bad, then I think people should know the extent to it. And if AGP is not so bad, I think that people will really benefit from it being kind of brought onto the light. So again, I'm comfortable talking about it because I don't think it's that bad. And I think that like when I talk about my experiences, a lot of trans people are like, oh, that's kind of like my experience. And a lot of cis people are even like, oh, that's kind of like my experience. Or, oh, that's not as bad as I thought it might have been. And the result is everyone understands each other a little bit better, and we're all better off for it. So I think it's really important to talk about, not just for trans people, but for cis people and everyone involved in the trans discourse.
Yeah, I agree it's important too. And I think it's ultimately not as scary or as big of a deal as a lot of people make it out to be. Like the word itself is kind of scary, but it's like it's not the auto part that even sounds scary, it's the gynephilia part, but that just means attraction to women, So it's
Yeah,
I think it's
it's the
just not
philia
unfortunate.
feeling.
Yeah, it's the philia, and then the gyna part, like some people will associate with like, or women will associate with like gynecological visits maybe, and then have some ick around that. But like,
well, I really like your term, autosexual, and I think that if AGP gets discussed more, I think what's going to happen is people are going to start using another term, a less stigmatized term, like autosexual, and their definition, how they define autosexual for themselves, especially for like autosexual trans women who are attracted to women, it's going to basically align with AGP, but it's going to not have the same stigma that maybe the previous term had.
right. And I do think we're in a moment now
I
where,
think your audio's cut out.
yeah, my internet's been pretty dodgy for the last 10 minutes. Can you hear me now?
I can make sure it's not me.
I'm going to pause it.
Oh.
Yeah. One of the reasons I think that it's something I'm optimistic about is that more people are talking about being AGP or autosexual or whatever term they're using now. And I think that as more people's experiences get out there, it's just gonna in general completely not match the caricature that's been created.
I think so. Yeah.
And my hope is that through that sort of familiarity, it'll humanize the experience. And it's something that I think the trans movement tried to. I feel like the movement for same sex rights, like the homosexual rights movement, they advocated for what they were honestly for many years, and won people over through reason and through coming out and becoming more familiar. And I feel like the trans movement maybe tried to skip over that step and just institute a particular ideology top down, and
Mm-hmm.
not really go through the liberal process of acceptance. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's kind of biting them in the ass right now. And there's kind of this sort of backlash forming against trans people. And my hope is that um, AGP is inevitably going to get discussed publicly. I want it to cause the least damage possible when it does. And so I'm hoping that people will start being able to be a little more chill about it as more people come out as AGP.
Yeah, that would be my hope as well. Um, and unfortunately, the current legal and regulatory framework that we have disincentivizes discussing sort of uncomfortable truths, um, particularly, you know, let's say you have like a college, right? And they're deciding whether or not to fund research on AGP. Um, if that research is making students or other researchers and faculty uncomfortable, and in particular, it's creating like a hostile environment for those minority people, it's a really big legal issue for that college, right? They're going to run afoul of civil rights law. And so, or they could at the very least, right? And so I think that there's a lot of cautiousness, maybe over cautiousness even, just because the way these laws are written is ambiguous. There's an intense pressure to fall very safely on one side of them. And so I think that with AGP, it's not something that people feel comfortable talking about in universities. And it's not something that, like diversity coordinators are ever going to like broach, right? And so the way that people find out about like what trans is through all of these frameworks, which are designed, essentially to protect trans people at a legal level. And that's probably not good for like optimizing for truth. And it also probably makes a lot of people like pretty unhappy that they have to abide by norms that are just like hyper progressive. So yeah, I think there's a real culture of silence, and it's not good.
Yeah, I think it's sort of building resentment,
Mm-hmm.
because there's people that even though they never have to interact with trans people, that sort of maybe resent the idea that someday they'll be like forced to share their pronouns or like have someone get mad at them for misgendering. And
Mm-hmm.
I think people just don't want to feel like they're being um, like they're having their morality criticized or their moral integrity impugned, just for not staying up to date on the hyper progressive way of talking.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that most people are never going to, or rarely interact with a trans person. Probably never. Like, honestly, a lot of people are never going to interact with a trans person. I mean, I know that in my day-to-day life, like, if it weren't for trans people that I've met specifically through me being trans, there wouldn't be any trans people that I know. And so, I think about like jobs that I've had as well, no trans people. Most people are just not going to interact with a lot of trans people. And the idea that like everyone in society needs to be made hyper aware of these things, needs to be like constantly worried about like misgendering or whatever, needs to be educated on whatever the feminist cant is, was probably pretty bad. So, or it's probably pretty frustrating for these people and doesn't really help trans people either. So there's this really frustrating situation, which we're kind of locked into, where no one's really being served by the current approach to protecting trans interests. And the result is kind of tragic.
Yeah, I agree that right now the current situation, it sort of like only serves online activism.
Yeah,
almost.
exactly.
Um,
Yeah, that and like HR departments, right? Diversity coordinators, that sort of stuff.
yeah, the sort of like the hall monitors of the corporate structure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, it does give people like that more power, but I think the cost is that it's hurting trans acceptance just because I don't think people want to feel like they're forced. They don't want to do the compelled speech thing.
Mm-hmm.
They don't like it and they resent it. And I'm optimistic that trans acceptance will ultimately improve as more truth is brought to bear on the situation, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe the trans movement at some point can become more reasonable once a large enough proportion of trans people are in alignment with truth in terms of understanding the distinct etiologies of transgenderism.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now it feels almost like this sort of trans ideology just organically evolved out of just transgender people, particularly trans women, just talking to each other. And the sort of like central rule is to just not invalidate anyone's identity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think that's part of it. But I also think that a lot of it isn't organic. I think a lot of it is probably downstream from law. And, I alluded to this earlier, but the specific way in which civil rights law has been sort of bureaucratized, expanded, and enforced. The reason why you have all of these companies, big companies like Google or Facebook or ExxonMobil, any big company is going to have people that they employ to make sure that everything that is being said within their company is inclusive, right? And there's nothing in the law that says like they have to do that. But the way that companies protect against, discrimination lawsuits is by showing that they're meeting industry best practices for preventing discrimination in the workplace. So all of these companies are kind of like in an arms race with each other, where as some companies adopt more standards or more procedures for making sure that they're like totally progressive and nice and not making any sort of harm in the workplace, those standards, those practices become standard. And then if another company isn't meeting them, then if they're brought into a courtroom and someone's saying this company discriminated against me or created a hostile environment, one of the things that the judge is going to ask is, well, were you meeting these best practices? And if they aren't, that's a mark against them. And so even if nothing is like codified in law, we're in this very weird situation where activists have a ton of power to go to these companies and to sort of like decide what is best practices and what these companies should be implementing. This isn't just true with workplaces, it's also true with the government, of course. And so the result is that all of these spaces, communal spaces that people find themselves in, are made to be like hyper progressive, which is just like totally unnatural. And it's not that like everyone follows these systems. Like, you know, Americans are broadly not super hyper progressive in these ways, but there's a feeling that everyone is, right? And I think that feeling stems in part from the fact that in a lot of the environments where we talk to people and meet people today, which is, you know, through work and school, we sort of have to censor ourselves. And so I think it's a deeply unnatural thing that we find ourselves in. And the positive of that is, because I do think a lot of this is downstream from law, I think can be changed legally as well. And, you know, changing these laws are just changing the way we enforce civil rights law to be like a little bit more sensible, to not lead to these like kinds of arms races. That's something that is very much being talked about within conservative circles and the conservative activist class. So I think there's reason to be optimistic that maybe this will change socially, and then suddenly it'll be way easier to talk about these things and get trans people what they actually need in terms of rights.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring up basically that law is the origin of a lot of the stuff. Is it basically the sort of the Richard Hanania thesis about where wokeness comes from?
Yeah, totally. I was like just speaking to him recently about this. But yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that is part of it, that there's these organizations that they're worried about getting some sort of lawsuit against them, and so just to err on the side of caution, they'll try to be like a little more progressive, and that just creates an evolutionary pressure to just only go in one direction. And it's, after many years of this, it's gone to a point where it's just so different from how just regular people interact that I think a lot of people experience it as like hostile and authoritarian.
Yeah, super weird. And it also discourages people from like solving their own problems, right? Like, we want people to be able to negotiate boundaries with each other rather than having to like run to the hall monitor or run to some authority. And, you know, it sucks for us as a society, as a people, that we've sort of, you know, inculcated in a few generations, that the way you solve problems is by sort of demanding that someone step in and act as the authoritarian for you. So there's all sorts of pernicious societal effects that we see that are probably informed by the legal system, as well as other things, of course.
Yeah. And to be fair, the advent of social media is definitely a big factor here. But yeah, it's unfortunate that it's kind of, people are being rewarded for becoming snitches and tattletales. And I think that makes people in general feel less comfortable thinking out loud and speaking their mind. And it makes them feel less stable in their social standing.
I think so.
Earlier you had mentioned that you became more comfortable with some of your maleness. Was there any like particular sort of thought exercises you went through to do that, or any moments? Because I'm hoping that maybe something that you mentioned might help someone in the audience deal with their maleness or femaleness respectively.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it's like not super applicable to people, unfortunately. Like the OnlyFans thing, right? Like stopping OnlyFans. That was huge for me. Okay. Yeah. A big thing that helped me is developing other sources of value in my life, right? So, like, I have worked really hard in the past year to improve other elements of my life that don't have to do with my appearance. So, trying to focus on getting more healthy, right? And of course, that can have like downstream effects on my appearance. I don't think it has really, 'cause I've always been like thin, but just trying to like exercise and being able to like look at like, okay, I've exercised this many times in the past month, and that's more than the previous month. That's awesome. It makes me feel good about myself. It makes me feel like I can tell myself that I'm going to do something and do it and achieve a goal. Trying to, succeed more professionally, trying to more critically engage with hobbies or interests that I have, to produce more rather than consuming. There's all sorts of societal things that we all deal with that sort of suck away our sense of self-worth, right? So if you're scrolling every day on social media for 6 hours, you're probably not going to feel super good about yourself. And so when you look in the mirror and you see like some masculine elements, that's going to hit pretty hard. But if you have spent like a day really living your values, right? Whatever that means to you. Maybe you are creating art because that really matters to you. Maybe you are speaking with friends. Another one of my goals has been to speak more with friends and family. If you, volunteer at a soup kitchen, whatever it is, and you look in the mirror and, you see masculine elements of yourself, maybe you think like, okay, yeah, I've got these masculine elements. I don't like those, but I feel good about myself in all of these other ways, right? I still feel like I have all of this internal value. Then it's a lot easier to deal with those masculine elements because they're just one piece of you, right? And you have all these other pieces that hinge on how you evaluate yourself, and those matter as well. So I don't think you can just like talk yourself out of being frustrated with male elements of yourself or convince yourself that you're like totally okay with them, but you can build robustness and resiliency to those feelings.
Yeah, I think that's a good sort of guideline for dealing with it, because like I'm pretty masculine, which feels unfortunate to my AGP brain, but like I have noticed that if I'm doing other things, like you mentioned exercising, if I'm doing exercising and eating right, for instance, I'm implicitly caring about myself by doing that, which implies that like I'm worth caring about, for example.
Yeah, totally.
And also there's just other sources of meaning, like you said, friendship, family. And I find this sort of like gender stuff I do somewhat meaningful too, because I sort of see this problem that needs to get fixed, that there's this thing that's causing gender dysphoria and people are too bashful to talk about it. And I think it's a problem because it's like you said earlier, it makes us out of alignment with truth.
Yeah. Another thing I'd mention is meditation. I think meditation is really valuable. I don't think you even necessarily need to do it all the time, but doing it consistently for a month, right? 4 weeks in a row will give you like a new tool for navigating the world. And that's the ability to kind of self-reflect and be like, is what I'm thinking right now valuable? Is what I'm doing right now valuable? I'll give you an example. I used to always think to myself, or not always, but occasionally I'd lay in bed and I would think like, oh, I really wish that I were like dating a man and that man could sort of like care for me and like, love me and et cetera, and et cetera. When I started to meditate, I would reflect on those thoughts. And I realized that like when I imagined that relationship with a man, I was not imagining like any sexual aspects of it really, even though maybe some of my thoughts would like, they would be articulated in my mind as sexual thoughts. When I would critically evaluate them, I would think like, do I actually want to like have sex with a man right now in this moment? And the answer was no. And I think what I realized is I just had like negative feelings welling up inside me. And I was just, I was sort of missing like a masculine presence in my life that I maybe didn't have in my childhood. And once I realized that, I was able to contextualize my feelings and understand that the true source of them was not like lack of sexual fulfillment. The true source was actually more emotional. And sometimes when I like go on the internet, I will post something, I'll be like, I don't know. I talk a lot about democracies. Sometimes maybe I'll be like, all these voters are like so ill-informed and da 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 da. I'll be going off on it. And I can critically self-evaluate and be like, am I saying that because I really believe that it's like very valuable to say it in this way right now? Or am I saying it that way to make myself feel better about my, what I know about the world, right? And I realized that a lot of times when I engage in behaviors, I'm engaging them to like self-soothe and to make myself feel better about the world, but they're not actually improving my station in life. They're not actually improving my situation. And so they're really just like a kind of temporary band-aid. And realizing that has allowed me to move away from surrogate activities that make me feel like I'm succeeding. Video games would be another one. And towards activities which are actually succeeding in my own personal evaluation. So long description to just say like meditation also definitely recommend.
Yeah, no, I mean that was good, especially the bit about just in general noticing when you're doing surrogate activities instead of like the direct ones that will benefit you.
Totally.
I want to bring up you wrote a really good essay about a year or so ago called "The Tragedy of Female Identification," and was wondering if you'd be willing to talk about that for a bit.
Totally. Is there any specific thing that I should start on?
Oh, I didn't I didn't read it today to like check up on it.
Well, I mean, just like impressions, right? Like, could you talk about like this, however it made you feel, like,
Oh, I think what I liked about it was that it was so realistic in terms of like, yes, you really want this thing to be the other sex to the greatest extent possible, to literally be female, and yet
mm-hmm,
chasing that unattainable desire just makes you suffer a lot.
mm-hmm,
And ultimately, in the end, a more realistic goal is just becoming a version of yourself that you value.
yeah, I think that's right. I think also there's a few things here. I mean, that essay, in some way, it's just about like, what is a woman and how trans women talk to themselves about what they are and what their goals are. And in that essay, I kind of come down on the side of there's no coherent definition of woman that includes all trans women, and definitions of women that do include trans women tend to be based on sex stereotypes, and that's probably like not healthy. It's hard to decide on a set of sex stereotypes in a non-biased way. The tendency is to just sort of like draw a circle around our own presentation and be like, well, that's what a woman is, right? And anything that falls out, isn't a woman. It's very selfish and probably not super helpful. But I think what I also talk about is this feeling that I had, I think a lot of trans people have during transition, which is when you first start transitioning and you get on estrogen, you sort of make leaps and bounds in terms of getting more feminine, right? Even like small things make you feel a lot more feminine than before. And it's sort of easy to get like 70% of the way there to being seen as a woman by people. Unfortunately, you have to be seen like, 100% or, even more, or, pretty close to that in order to like pass, right? So like if 70% of it is working for you, but you have like huge Adam's apple, right? Or you have a deep voice or whatever, that's going to be pretty hard to pass as a woman. But even if your voice is 80% there, right? But like 20% of the time it's just a bit off, right? Or the pitch is just 20% off, or the resonance is just a bit off. People are going to clock that like pretty easily because non-trans women, cisgender women, they fall on a sort of bell curve, right? And the bell curve is not that big in terms of their voice. And especially when you start adding in all of these other things, right? Like, maybe you're really tall as well, right? So like I'm 5'10", only about 2% of women are my height or taller. If you're 6'3", there are more trans women your height than there are cisgender women your height. So just on like the 6'3" basis alone, someone could look at you, even if your voice is perfect, everything is perfect, and be like, that's a trans woman. And so it seems like, getting more and more feminine, first 95% good, but those last percents really, really difficult. And that's when people start pursuing surgery. And it turns out you can pursue a lot of surgery and still not quite get there. And that can be really agonizing. And it can also be really difficult to talk about because I think the metaphor that I use in the essay is like you're moving down this tunnel towards a light, towards the goal, and you keep going and going. The light keeps receding away from you. And people who are sort of behind you in the tunnel, they look at you getting closer and closer, and they're like, you're practically in it. Like you've made it. Like you are in the light. And you are, from your perspective, being like, I'm not. Like, I'm not reaching my goal. And so people don't really get it as well. People will be very confused if you, to them, pass really well, but you like don't feel good about it. So a lot of times trans women, they'll talk to their friends and they'll be like, oh, I don't feel like I passed sufficiently well. And their friends are like, oh, you passed great, right? And that's not very helpful, but it's because I think we're all at different positions in this journey, and we can't really see the distance in front of the other person. We just see their side or their back or whatever. And I think it's really important to recognize when obsessing over that last percentage of femininity is no longer serving you. And in that case, I think it's time to maybe move to other sources of value in life, like we've talked about. Yeah, I think that maybe that's one piece that you resonated with in that essay.
Yeah, but and I'll definitely link it because I remember when I first read it, I was like, this is really good. Like this is something that all trans women should basically be forced to read, like if they're going to transition, because it's so many of them have a.
That's such a good compliment, by the way.
Well, it helps set people up for realistic expectations. I think that's one of the biggest reasons people are dissatisfied with transition is because they have this idyllic image in their mind of like what female beauty is, and then they see all the trans women online who are using filters and putting together the most perfect angles to present themselves, and then they compare themselves among people they see as their peers, and they continually fall short and feel dissatisfied and feel like they're uniquely being failures when they might just be having a typical outcome of transition where like it's for a lot of people it is a marginal change in, like if you don't do surgeries, like the hormones, it makes just a very subtle change for some people that it's
Mhm.
almost not noticeable, and there's just so much chance involved. And yeah, I just worry that people are undergoing transition with, without knowing why, in terms of like the AGP, and then
Mhm.
also without having realistic expectations of like what is possible, and how will you still be, maybe you should ahead of time think of ways you can still be happy even if you fall short of your goal.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think there's like two directions I want to go on this. Just as a small piece, I think early on in my transition, I sort of figured to myself that like, if I transition and I'm not like gorgeous, I'm not a supermodel, whatever, that's fine. If I just look like a totally like normal girl, that's great. Or even if I look like a sort of like slightly unattractive girl, that's fine. Just as long as I look like, a girl, not like a guy. Um, and I thought I was being like super reasonable in that goal. But it turns out that that's actually like not that reasonable of a goal. And in some ways, it's like easier to be sort of like a model-esque androgynous person if you're a trans woman transitioning than it is to be like a totally 100% passing girl. Because there's a lot of barriers to overcome to get there. So I think sometimes when trans women set their goals early in transition, one thing that I would hear is like, would you be happy being an ugly girl? If so, transition's probably going to be good for you. And it's like, no. Like, are you going to be happy just being a more feminine version of yourself? That should be your metric. Because, being totally fasting is just not feasible for a lot of people. And if it is feasible for a lot of people, it's feasible through things like surgery, like you're talking about, where it's just like, is spending tens of thousands of dollars on plastic surgery feasible for a lot of people? No, it's not. And you need to be like really realistic about like, am I going to be okay if I'm not, 100% fish or whatever? Yeah. And the answer is yes, you probably are going to be okay with that. And tons of trans people in history have been like, okay with that. And so you can be okay with that, but it begins with accepting what is possible.
Yeah, and that is definitely a much more realistic goal, just becoming a more feminine version of yourself,
Mm-hmm.
or even inversely having a goal of not becoming more masculine.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, I think so many trans women will just think if I can just stop the testosterone poisoning, that's enough for me.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Totally reasonable.
In your experience with the trans community, like I assume you've seen other trans women where you think, yeah, they're probably of the autogynephilic etiology as well. And so I'm curious, like, what you think if you were to estimate the proportion of trans women who fall under that. If this is too controversial of a question to answer, you don't have to.
No, I mean, I used to have something I would say, I would call it Taft's iron law of autogynephilia, which is the longer you know a trans woman, the chance that she says something AGP or admits to AGP approaches 100%. And so that has been my personal experience, is that a lot of people, even people who are like self-proclaimed HSTS, talk to them long enough and eventually they say something weird like, that is just straight up AGP that you're describing. So I don't know if I've ever met a trans woman who wasn't AGP. And every trans woman that I've ever met who I didn't think was AGP at first eventually said something that made me think they were AGP. So I don't know. I don't know how to estimate that.
Well, I
But
mean,
I would
you kind
say,
of did. It's
yeah,
basically all of them, at least in terms of your circles.
Yeah, at least in terms of my circles.
Then I think that's a reflection of reality. Like if you just add up, like calculate it by adding up the trans women who report having non-homosexual attractions, it's at least 80%. And then when you consider that there's the ones that are just the AGPs that are just meta attracted or just LARPing as
It's got to be
HSTS
like
or whatever.
95% plus
Right.
at minimum. Yeah.
Yeah. If I were to guess, it's 95% feels pretty comfortable. And then it seems like most of the HSTS, at least in the US, would be more among like the Black and Latino populations where there's like a little more homophobia, and that's sort of a way that very effeminate gay males could have a better life in those subcultures.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah, I could see that. Because I will also say, I think that like in terms of like white trans women that I know, they seem to sometimes be like the most AGP cohort, at least just like in my personal experience. So
absolutely, yeah. Which is why it's funny sometimes to see when there's people doing trans women doing social justice arguing amongst each other online, and then you have some of the like Black or Latina ones like criticizing white trans women, and it's just like I can't help but translate this into like grievance between the different ideologies, you know.
Yeah, I could totally see that.
Yeah, I imagine you mostly just talk to trans women, but have you talked to many trans men, and if so, have you noticed whether any of them seem autoandrophilic?
I have not. I sort of have like no conceptual grapple of autoandrophilia or what autosexuality looks like in females.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised by that. It does seem like, at least on the internet, that trans women and trans men they sort of have completely separate subcultures and online spaces to hang around, which you know it makes sense. They have a fun. They're both like trying to achieve something that the other ones like are trying to get rid of. You know, like trans women are trying to get femaleness, and then the trans men are trying to get rid of femaleness and attain maleness. So they kind of like they both want different things, and I think it's hard for them to coexist in terms of finding a way of speaking that doesn't end up offending the other group, because they both value the opposite things in terms of gender.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I also think, I mean, ironically, I follow a lot of like bodybuilding content, and I've always been like sort of fascinated by bodybuilders. Just the cell culture is like super interesting to me. But what I see in a lot of bodybuilders is like an aesthetic vision that they're trying very hard to get to, which is like hyper masculine. And they're willing to do all sorts of like biohacking about it. They seem to have like a lot of like body dysmorphia sometimes. Like they have like words for it too, like where they just see themselves as like too small, right? And I totally just see them as like the other side of the coin to me. And I think maybe part of that is the fact that they're natal male. I feel like there's like a certain like male obsession with an aesthetic ideal, which I see in them and I also see in myself. We're just going in different directions. And I think sometimes when I go into like trans guy subcultures, the way that they relate to masculinity is like confusing to me in a way that like how bodybuilders relate to masculinity like makes sense to me. So maybe there's like something to that with how they relate to masculinity, which I don't fully get.
No, I think that's a good point. Like I do think that males they're more visually oriented. They're about in terms of like what is deemed attractive. It's very much the aesthetic. And then with the females, it seems like they care more about actions and behavior and what that means about your personality.
I think so.
You know, so like the trans men they won't be obsessed with going to the gym generally as much, but they will care about doing guy things and
Mm,
being seen by others as a guy, and just spiritually being a dude.
dude. I love that for
Yeah.
them. There's this book, you're probably familiar with it. It's called A Billion Wicked Thoughts.
Yeah.
But yeah, they talk about that. They talk about the sort of the male hypervisual sexual aspect and the female contextual aspect. So yeah, definitely alluding to that idea.
Yeah. And you see it in the type of erotica people consume, where
Mhm.
women like the written erotica and men like porn.
Yeah, totally. Or even like men who are attracted to trans women. Um, it's very visual. Like they're keying off of a shape which is very feminine, right? Like boobs and hips and narrow waist and feminine facial features. A lot of them like they just really like those things, and it can be very confusing for guys who are not gamp or whatever it is, right? Who are just
Yeah.
like they're purely attracted to femininity. They see a trans woman, they're attracted to that, and then the penis is not attractive to them. Maybe it's a turnoff, or it's a neutral thing if they're again still not attracted to the androgyny. But I think it's just because guys are like so visual, they they can ignore other things, right? Like guys will the joke is that guys will get off to a curvy piece of driftwood. Like you're never putting babies in that driftwood, and yet it's got the shape of a woman, and it doesn't matter if it's got weird bits sticking out occasionally. Like it looks like it has tits, and that's enough. So guys are super visual.
Yeah. It's just like the curves or silhouette of something is just
Mm,
appealing to them.
it can be enough. Yeah.
Yeah. That's it, and that's something I find really interesting about learning about autoheterosexuality in both sexes, is that it really, I think it's an excellent lens into just regular heterosexuality, what each sex wants out of the other sex. Because there's so many times I see trans men talking online amongst each other, and it seems like they're basically trying to become like a woman's idea of the perfect boyfriend,
Mm, that's
you know,
funny.
in terms of like, treating the woman right, and supporting her, like all the things that feminists like kind of want
Hmm.
men to be. They like try to be that.
Interesting.
It's
And
kind of
that's kind of
heartwarming.
how that is heartwarming. That's kind of how you see like autosexuality manifesting within trans men.
Yeah, where they're like, if they're dating women in particular, they care about like being a good boyfriend
Hmm.
to them.
That's
Uh,
that's adorable.
yeah, and
Oh,
whereas like it's not as wholesome on the other side, like you're saying with the men, they're just like, if they're attracted to trans women, it's like, just wow, she's really hot.
but also in a weird way, that kind of makes like trans women like it makes them good partners in a way because like the guy is so hyper visual focused, the trans woman is so hyper visual focused. Her version of like being a good girlfriend is like, well, I'm going to look really hot and I'm
Yeah,
going to like perform sexual favors for you. And so for a certain type of man that's like perfect, right?
yeah, they agree on what matters.
Yeah. Or at least can. That's I don't know, that can be wholesome in its own way, so that's cool.
Yeah, it's that's a good point. I have it's yeah, it seems like some gamps kind of just, they almost want to date um like autistic boys with boobs, almost like that they want like a girlfriend like with
Mm-hmm.
a male personality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it does seem, like, obvious. I think a trans woman would be more likely to understand like why the boyfriend likes video games,
Yeah.
and things like that. So yeah, it's interesting how that creates a different, like almost a different type of, the sort of meta attraction creates a different type of homosexuality, where
Mm-hmm.
where it's technically homosexual just because they're same sex, but then they're sort of choosing who does which heterosexual role.
Yeah. Super interesting. And again, I mean, this is something I alluded to earlier, but like my attraction to men feels like quite genuine. And that's something that I've like always never been like I've never fully understood. Because I think there are elements of my attraction to guys which are like more meta attracted, you know? Like if a guy is like commenting on my appearance, I might find that sexy. But also like I feel like I'm just attracted to guys like very directly, in a kind of like visual way that is like standard for my sexuality. And so I wonder, it'd be interesting to ask you this. I wonder if there's any room within autosexual models to have, in the same way that someone might be like bisexual, where they're like attracted to men and women, you can be like both attracted to the self, both attracted in and attracted out. And I feel like that describes like my sexuality. But I don't know if there's any kind of, I don't know if you've heard of this or what your perspective is.
Are you mean it in terms of like trying to make sense of why an autogynephilic trans woman may be directly attracted to male physique?
I guess for me, it feels like I just have AGP, and that's part of one part of my sexuality. But then I also feel like I have like outwards directed sexuality as well. And
Yeah.
those sometimes like connect and interact.
Right. It's
But
like a
sometimes,
spectrum of, yeah.
yeah. And sometimes they can be like apart. Like I don't have to be like engaging in AGP fantasy to just be like aroused by, you know, a visual element of my partner. And so like, yeah, I guess, I don't know, thoughts on that.
Yeah. The way I usually try to make sense of that, like if it's like attraction to men, I mean, like with the attraction to women, that almost doesn't need an explanation because, like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's just gynephilia.
Mm-hmm.
But with the attraction to men, I think that for trans women are that have really deeply internalized the like woman self concept and
Mm.
live their lives as women and get treated by as one, you know, like you probably in your everyday life, people just, I bet people almost never call you he, you know?
Yeah, I don't really get that.
Right. And so I think that leads to a really solid, like crystallized inner female identity. And so when that happens, I think the attraction to men won't even feel like meta anymore. Just because like if it's always from the female perspective, just because you've internalized that perspective so solidly, I think it's not gonna seem like meta attraction.
Mm-hmm.
Like whereas like I think trans women early in transition, it might seem more like meta attraction, but then if say they're like 10 years in and really passing and stuff, it's just gonna seem like regular attraction at that point, even if it ultimately came from a different source. Basically, I sometimes describe it as like software update androphilia versus hardware androphilia. You know, just
Yeah, see, that's interesting, but it's also, I I knew I was attracted to men before I knew I was AGP. And so like early on,
yeah,
you know, when I was like 13, 14, I remember having crushes on like my male classmates and just like interacting with them. I found, you know, it's not like sexually arousing, but like it just like it gave me that like feeling of like, oh my god, like I really like find you attractive and like you're cute and like I want to like date you. Um and so like I knew at that time that I was attracted to boys. And it was like much later that I was able to understand the sort of AGP piece. And so for me, you know, it was before I transitioned, obviously. And yeah, there is an element of meta attraction to it. But it's just, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to disentangle sometimes.
yeah. No, it legitimately is hard to disentangle, and when people do critique the sort of typology or the autogynephilia theory, like I kind of get it to some extent, where they're just perceiving it as maybe people just trying to invalidate their attractions.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it does seem to be a different thing from like conventional attraction, but it's like you said, it's hard to disentangle. And
Mm-hmm.
there also, I can recall there were some cases in, I believe, Hirschfeld's book where transvestites described having crushes on their like classmates or even male teachers around like
Mhm.
ages of like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so it does seem like either meta attraction can appear that early before you're even cognizant that it's from a female perspective,
Mhm.
or that it can be genuine androphilia.
Mm.
Although if it was the conventional kind of attraction to men, I would kind of expect that would also be internalized, and then basically they'd be like, say, like auto bisexual or whatever.
Mm.
Then
Mm.
I
Mm.
would think someone like that would also be less likely to suffer gender dysphoria. You know, if they could see the
Interesting.
if like their attraction to men got internalized, they'd be less likely to suffer from their maleness.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I guess there's a deeper thing that's going on here in this conversation, which is just that, like, part of the tricky aspect of talking about sexology or sexuality with people is that it's pretty hard to tell, like, what is going on in someone else's mind. It's pretty hard to tell sometimes what's going on in our
Yeah,
own
it's hard.
minds. Yeah, much less what's in other people's. And so I think a lot of people, they sort of chafe against sexology. And part of that, I think, is maybe like a genuine fault on the people who are interested in the theories, because there's a tendency to like label people and be like, well, you are like definitely AGP. And when I talk about these things with people, when I talk about AGP with people, I try to just like describe my experience as it is. And I'll sometimes get questions. People will ask me like, well, I do this thing. Is that AGP? And I feel like I can't answer that totally, because it's like, I can imagine like a cisgender woman who, for her, like dressing in lingerie before having sex, it's like an important part of how she enjoys sex. And it's not that she is like being aroused by putting on lingerie. It might just be like a self-confidence thing for her, right? So she might just feel like, you know, I, I like feeling self-confident, and that's totally non-sexual, but it's part of what gets me, feeling comfortable enough to have sex. That might not be AGP at all, right? But doing that same behavior totally could be AGP. And so sometimes people will ask me these questions, and I just feel like, I can't diagnose you. Like, I can't tell you whether or not you're doing this because deep-seated wise, there's some like sexual arousal at being a woman. But I can just tell you my experience, and I can tell you that maybe that's AGP and maybe not. So yeah, I don't know. It's tough, but I would hope that in the sexology community, there's like some mindfulness to that, in being like, I guess I will tell you, I think in your strategic, describing autosexuality, mainstreaming it, I think one thing that might make that easier for you is if you avoid like labeling people and more just like label the actual behaviors.
Yeah, it tends to get a bad reaction in my experience. I
Yeah.
like I te- I used to, more early on, like tell someone, say like online, if I'm arguing or
Mm-hmm.
discussing with someone, I would say they're AGP.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that was that like early on, for myself, I was trying to figure out what was real, and I had
Mm-hmm.
to deal with like, why did trans women lie to me about this? And just basically,
Huh.
it was bothering me that like that what I considered real was being denied.
Yeah.
But I agree. It's not generally good optics to do that. It pushes people away, and they sort of like see you as arrogant and like unjustified, like a know-it-all, that like, how can you possibly know what's going on in someone's brain?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do tend to think that like you said, most trans
Probably a
women
lot
do
of
seem
them.
to be this type. And so it's a tough thing to like. I generally hold back from doing that, from telling someone they're AGP, but it's sometimes I just, I'm human and I have limits to my patience, and or I just might be irritable in the moment for other completely unrelated reasons. And it's just, yeah, I hear your point on strategy, and I appreciate you offering your perspective, because I do think, like I've said, you seem to think through things on a more deep level and are pretty self-aware, and so any advice you have is welcome about this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I realized this early on in a sort of separate but related topic, which was dysphoria. There used to be lots of debates on the internet about if you needed dysphoria to be trans. And what I think I realized pretty early on is that like people will describe dysphoria differently and label different behaviors as dysphoria, or different like patterns of thought as dysphoria. And so, I realized that like maybe what one person labels as euphoria, another person might be like, oh, I feel good because I'm no longer dysphoric right now. And I sort of, yeah, right. And it's tricky because we're all using this language, and it's so weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I was like, I just realized that like, okay, I don't think it's reliable to say like, you are trans if you have dysphoria, or you aren't trans if you don't, because we don't necessarily all agree on this definition of dysphoria. And I can't necessarily tell someone if they have dysphoria without being in their brain. And so I opted for just like when I interact with people, I just take them at their word for things. And, if they say that they're trans, I don't feel like, a need to deeply interrogate that unless it's like relevant for some reason. Like if I am, if I want to have a discussion about dysphoria, I might be like, do you have dysphoria? If it's not obvious that they do. And so I think that just that approach of just like always taking people at their word and approaching people like totally honestly with good faith has been really helpful for me in terms of getting people to like listen to my ideas. So yeah, I don't know. I think that it'd be nice. I think one collective path forward to having some of these difficult conversations begins with just that like mutual respect and, not trying to label people.
Yeah, I agree. That is the general best practice as a default way of doing things. And I think for most people, definitely, that there's going to be, I think like for people like me who like continually have the same discussion for years on end, basically, like at a certain point we kind of run out of patience of like feeling
so
like,
much resistance. You really want to call people AGP online.
well, it's not like I want to. It's just like
it just bursts out.
It's just it's just like so obvious where it's annoying to have to talk around it instead of just like to basically be like, hey, the sky is blue,
Yeah.
Like it's something that like, yeah, it's readily observable to me, and so I want to be able to comment on it. But yeah, no, you're right. It's not good to do that, and I generally hold back.
I do think there's like a reasonable limit though, because like, if someone like is typing in all caps like 1,000 exclamation points, and you're like, this person's clearly mad, or you like reference them being mad. Like, I don't know. I'm not in their brain. I don't know if they're like actually mad, but like, I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that they're mad. So like, I think there's of course like reasonable things, or like reasonable levels where you're like, this is just like so far in the camp of AGP that like we should just call it what it is. So yeah, I guess like there's definitely like exceptions where it's like talking about a broad behavior, probably okay to just describe it as AGP.
Yeah, and But honestly, like I think a lot of people discuss AGP as a set of behaviors rather than a sexual orientation. And like for example,
Interesting.
like like the TERFs and RADFEMs, they often talk about AGP as if it's like a set of behaviors
Mm.
rather than like an internalized form of sexuality. And like I talk about it as
Oh, huh.
like a sexuality,
Yeah.
because like homosexuality isn't just like homosexuality is like same-sex attraction,
Right. It's
but
not
it
butt
it's
fucking or
not
whatever.
just having sex with someone of the same sex,
Hmm.
or like flirting with them.
Hmm.
um but yeah, I just noticed when people talk about AGP, often the haters, like some of the feminists, they are specifically referring to behaviors they don't like,
Yeah.
um such as males wearing dresses in public or
Hmm.
using their
Bathroom
bathrooms.
selfies. Yeah.
Yeah, the bathroom selfie thing, that that sh- just is, I know there's probably not too many like trans rights activists listening to this, but like you should discourage your fellow trans women from doing those. I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it doesn't make people feel super comfortable when you're taking photos in the restroom. Yeah.
Yeah, just regardless of your sex, like that's
Yeah. No, I
usually.
think it's good advice for everyone, quite frankly. Yeah.
Yeah. um yeah, is there anything else you think of related to gender and trans stuff you want to touch on before we wrap up?
Mm. No, I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah.
A long thought. Huh?
Well, that's how I know you really thought about it. That's good.
Mhm. Yeah. I take your questions seriously.
Do you want me to link to any of your stuff in the notes?
Yeah, for sure. The Caprisms Twitter is a good one because
Okay.
I don't post on OnlyFans anymore.
Right. Yeah, not your spicy Twitter, but your thoughts Twitter.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. What about Dollcast?
Oh yeah, definitely Dollcast. I mean, that's a new thing that I'm doing. I'm podcasting with Brianna Wu and Kelly Cadigan and Skylar Bogart. We do it weekly. We interview all sorts of people. We've interviewed like um, Cenk Uygur and Colin Wright, and yeah, it's been pretty fun, just going through and talking about trans stuff and cultural stuff with them. But yeah, I'm excited about the project, and I think there's definitely potential for it to go pretty far. So
Yeah, I would like to see it continue, and I hope it can stay stable. I think like there's a volatility with having four people on it together, just more variables and more relations.
that's true. I do think even if it, um, I think if we lost people, like I think we could be okay, right? Like as long as it's just like one person or maybe two people, whoever are the people left, they could probably continue it on. But yeah, I think there is volatility with that.
Yeah. I mean, I've listened to a few of them so far. I think it's pretty good, especially because of Brianna's connections with all the famous people.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I will say, if we lost Brianna, it would, I think, no longer maybe be Dollcast. Which
Right.
I know that she doesn't conceptualize it that way. She definitely sees it as like we're all the Dollcast, or like she's definitely would be like comfortable being in the background. But I think that without her, it would probably. I think she's a big part of what makes Dollcast Dollcast.
Right. And I sort of like informally see her as the leader of
Yeah,
the project.
I think so too. I think that's entirely accurate. Even though, again, she would hate to like hear that. I think because I don't think that's how she wants it to be, or how she necessarily conceptualizes it herself. But yeah, I think that she's the. I think she's the one with the idea for the doll cast, and I think she came up with the name and everything. So
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me today, Taj. I'm going to end recording now.
For sure.